The Ashford estate didn't just sit on the landscape, it dominated it. A sprawling architectural beast of gray stone and cold ambition resting on 3 acres of manicured Connecticut soil. To Alina Martinez, standing at the servants' entrance on a particularly brutal November morning, the house felt less like a residence and more like a mausoleum, a monument to a grief she couldn't yet name but could feel radiating from the brickwork like a physical chill. The wind whipped around the corners of the building, biting through her thin coat, but the tremor in her hands wasn't just from the cold. At 26, Alina had spent the last 3 years navigating the treacherous waters of domestic service since arriving from Mexico, but she had never stood before a fortress quite like this. She clutched her interview letter as if it were a shield. She had been a nanny, a housekeeper, and a confidant to 5 different families, and every single time the ending was the same: a polite dismissal, a severance check, and the unspoken reality that they wanted someone with a posher accent, a lighter complexion, or a pedigree that didn't scream immigrant struggle. Alina had learned to armor herself against the rejection, to treat it as a professional hazard rather than a personal failing, but the stakes had never been this high. The salary Alexander Ashford was offering wasn't just generous, it was life-altering, nearly double anything she had earned before. But the job listing had been cryptic, almost foreboding. Live-in carer required for single father and young son. Discretion paramount. Experience with special needs essential. Thick skin required. It read less like a job advertisement and more like a warning. The heavy oak door creaked open, revealing a woman who looked as though she had been carved from the same stone as the house. Mrs. Peyton, the head of household staff, wore a uniform so stiff and formal it looked like armor. "You must be Alina Martinez," she said, her voice devoid of warmth, checking a pocket watch that looked antique. "You are 3 minutes early. That is acceptable. Tardiness is a sin in this house, Miss Martinez, and Mr. Ashford does not forgive sins easily." Alina nodded, stepping into the foyer, and immediately felt the temperature drop. The interior was a museum of silence. Expensive artwork lined the walls, depicting stormy seas and desolate landscapes, while furniture that looked terrified to be sat upon stood in rigid formation. There were no photographs, no toys, no signs of life. It was a house that was holding its breath. "Follow me," Mrs. Peyton commanded, her heels clicking rhythmically on the marble floors, the sound echoing like gunshots in the empty corridor. "Mr. Ashford is in his study. Do not speak unless spoken to, do not fidget, and for the love of God, do not ask him about his wife." The warning hung in the air, heavy and ominous, as they stopped before a massive mahogany door. Mrs. Peyton knocked once, sharp and authoritative. "Come," a male voice barked from within, clipped and distracted. Entering Alexander Ashford's office was like stepping into the nerve center of a war room. The space was dominated by a desk the size of a small car, behind which sat a man surrounded by a fortress of computer monitors. He was typing furiously, a phone pressed to his ear, his attention completely consumed by whatever crisis was unfolding in the financial markets. Alexander Ashford was striking in a way that felt dangerous. Late 30s, wearing a bespoke suit that cost more than Alina's entire life earnings, with dark hair perfectly coiffed and a jawline that could cut glass. He was the heir to the Ashford pharmaceutical empire, a titan of industry, and according to the tabloids Alina had nervously researched on the bus ride over, the most eligible and emotionally unavailable widower in the state. He didn't look up when she entered. He simply gestured vaguely towards an uncomfortable leather chair while continuing his conversation, barking orders about hostile takeovers and quarterly earnings with the ruthless efficiency of a man who viewed human beings as numbers on a spreadsheet. Alina sat, folding her hands in her lap, observing him. She saw the power, yes, but she also saw the tension in his shoulders, the hollow darkness beneath his eyes, the way he attacked the keyboard as if he were trying to outrun a demon. When he finally slammed the phone down, the silence that followed was deafening. He picked up a manila folder, her file, and finally deigned to look at her. His gaze was piercing, cold, and utterly lacking in empathy. "Alina Martinez," he said, reading her name like it was an accusation. "You've worked for the Hendersons, the Blackwells, the Suttons, 5 families in 3 years. That suggests a lack of commitment, Miss Martinez, or incompetence." Alina kept her chin high, refusing to wither under his scrutiny. "The families had their reasons, sir," she replied, her voice steady, her accent lending a lyrical quality to her English. The Hendersons relocated to London. The Blackwell children were sent to boarding school. The Suttons decided they wanted an au pair from France. My references will confirm that my departure was never due to the quality of my care. Alexander made a dismissive noise, flipping the page. And your qualifications? I see no formal degrees in child psychology or special education. I have life experience, sir, Alina countered. I helped raise 3 siblings. I have cared for children from newborns to teenagers. A degree teaches you theory. Experience teaches you how to handle a tantrum at 3 a.m. or how to soothe a fever when medicine isn't working. Alexander leaned back, studying her with a mix of skepticism and boredom. This isn't a normal position, Miss Martinez. My son Thomas is 5 years old. He has been blind since birth, a congenital condition that is irreversible. Multiple specialists have confirmed it. He said the word irreversible with a finality that sounded like a prison sentence. He requires constant supervision. He needs help feeding, dressing, navigating the world. He has limited capabilities. The phrase made Alina's stomach twist. No child had limited capabilities, only limited opportunities. Thomas has had 7 caregivers in 3 years, Alexander continued, his voice dropping to a warning tone. They all failed. They either found the work too demanding or they made the fatal mistake of getting emotionally attached. They tried to fix him. I do not need a savior, Miss Martinez. I need a pair of eyes and hands. I need someone to keep him safe and ensure he doesn't walk into walls. I do not need you to love him. In fact, I forbid it. Alina felt a surge of indignation but tamped it down. May I ask about his mother? She asked quietly. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Alexander's face hardened into a mask of stone. My wife died when Thomas was 18 months old. Car accident. That information is not relevant to your duties. With respect, sir, it is, Alina pressed, treading on dangerous ground. A grieving child and a grieving father create a specific dynamic. To care for Thomas, I need to understand the landscape of his loss. Alexander stared at her, silence stretching between them like a taut wire. For a second, she thought he might fire her before he'd even hired her. Instead, he let out a short, humorless laugh. You're bold, I'll give you that. The job pays $75,000 a year, Sundays off, 2 weeks holiday. Mrs. Peyton runs the house, you run the boy. I am rarely home, and when I am not to be disturbed. Thomas is banned from this office. Under no circumstances is he to enter my workspace. Do you have questions? 1, Alina said. I need to meet him. Alexander blinked, genuinely surprised. That's highly irregular. Most applicants just want to see the contract. I am not most applicants, Alina said softly. I cannot know if I can help him unless I meet him, and he needs to approve of me too. Alexander looked at her for a long moment, assessing her. Fine, he snapped, already reaching for his ringing phone. Mrs. Peyton, take her to the nursery. If he screams at her, bring her back so I can sign her release papers. Dismissed, Alina followed Mrs. Peyton up the grand, sweeping staircase, the silence of the house pressing in on her. He is a difficult child, Mrs. Peyton warned in a hushed whisper as they walked down a long, shadow-filled gallery. Don't take it personally if he ignores you. He ignores everyone. His father believes it's his nature, a side effect of the darkness he lives in. They stopped before a heavy door with a small wooden sign that read Thomas. Alina took a deep breath, smoothing her skirt. She knocked gently, then entered. The room was expansive, filled with expensive, untouched toys and books that looked like props on a stage set. In the corner, facing the window where the gray rain lashed against the glass, sat a small boy in a rocking chair. He was slight for his age, drowning in a sweater that was too big for him, his dark hair messy. He didn't turn. He didn't move. He just rocked back and forth, a rhythmic, lonely motion. Alina signaled for Mrs. Peyton to stay back. She walked softly across the plush carpet, making enough noise so he could hear her approach. She knelt beside the chair. Thomas, she said softly, my name is Alina. The boy didn't react. His eyes, a striking, cloudy blue-gray, stared fixedly at the window. I'm here because I might be looking after you. Silence. But Alina, growing up in a house full of noise and chaos, had learned to read silence. She saw his knuckles, white as bone, gripping the armrests of the chair. She saw the tension in his neck. This wasn't a child lost in his own world. This was a child who was listening with the intensity of a hunted animal. I'm going to describe myself, Alina continued, keeping her voice melodic. I'm 26. I'm wearing a green cardigan that smells like rain because it's miserable outside. I have dark hair and I'm terrified right now because this house is very big and your father is very scary." The rocking stopped, just for a fraction of a second. "I've never looked after a blind boy before," she admitted, leaning closer. "I will probably be clumsy. I might make mistakes, but I promise I will never lie to you." Slowly, painfully slowly, Thomas turned his head. He didn't look at her, not exactly, but his face angled towards her voice. "You talk too much," he whispered. His voice was rusty, unused. "Everyone talks too much. They think because I can't see, I can't hear." Alina smiled, relief washing over her. "You are absolutely right. I am rambling. Should I leave?" Thomas sat frozen, his expression unreadable, before delivering a line that sent a shiver down Alina's spine. "It doesn't matter if you stay or go," he said, his voice void of emotion. "My father says I'm broken. You can't fix broken things, you just sweep them up eventually." Alina took the job, moving into the small, clinical staff quarters on the third floor that evening. The Ashford house was a silent beast that swallowed sound, and Alina quickly learned the rhythms of its isolation. Alexander Ashford was a ghost in his own home, leaving before dawn and returning long after Thomas was asleep, his presence marked only by the expensive scent of his cologne lingering in the hallway and the closed door of his study. Thomas was a different kind of ghost. For the first week, he was a study in rigid compliance. He allowed Alina to dress him, feed him, and guide him through the sprawling, empty rooms like a marionette waiting for its strings to be pulled. He didn't play with the mountains of expensive toys. He sat in his rocking chair, listening to audiobooks about space and dinosaurs, his mind clearly active even if his body was stagnant. Alina refused to accept the narrative that he was broken. She narrated their days, describing the way the winter light hit the floorboards, the colors of the food on his plate, the texture of the velvet curtains. She encouraged him to do things for himself, much to Mrs. Peyton's disapproval. "Mr. Ashford prefers we do everything for him." The housekeeper sniffed one afternoon as Alina taught Thomas how to button his own shirt by feel. "It is faster and it prevents accidents." "It also prevents growth," Alina countered, guiding Thomas's small fingers. "Independence is not an accident, Mrs. Peyton." Yet, as the weeks turned into a month, a creeping unease began to settle in Alina's gut. Living in such close quarters with Thomas, she began to notice fissures in the facade of his blindness, tiny inconsistencies that didn't align with the medical reality Alexander had presented. It started with small things that Alina initially dismissed as coincidence or heightened other senses. One afternoon, while they were in the library, Alina dropped a heavy book of fairy tales. Before it even hit the Persian rug with a dull thud, Thomas had flinched and turned his head precisely towards the spot where it would land, his hands coming up defensively. A blind child would react to the sound after it happened, searching for the source. Thomas had anticipated the impact. Another time, during lunch, Alina had placed a glass of apple juice near his elbow, not where she usually put it. He hadn't swept his hand to find it. He had reached directly for it, wrapping his fingers around the glass without a millisecond of hesitation. When she commented on his amazing spatial awareness, he had frozen, his face draining of color, and muttered something about hearing the ice cubes clink, even though the juice was room temperature. The doubt gnawed at her. She felt treacherous for even thinking it, like she was betraying the fragile trust they were building. But the evidence was mounting, painting a picture that seemed impossible. One rainy Tuesday, they were sitting on the nursery floor, Alina reading a new picture book aloud. The illustrations were vivid and fantastical. "And there was a great big dragon wearing a bright red hat," Alina read, describing the picture. Thomas, who had been tracing the patterns on the carpet, suddenly piped up. "It's not red," he said quietly. "It's orange like a sunset." Alina stopped reading. The air in the room went still. This book had been published last month. Mrs. Peyton had bought it on Monday. There was no way his mother could have described it to him years ago. "Thomas," Alina said, her heart hammering against her ribs, keeping her voice unnervingly calm. "How do you know the hat is orange?" The boy went rigid. His shoulders hunched up around his ears, a defensive posture that broke her heart. I guessed," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Orange is a better color for a dragon." It was a clumsy lie, the kind a frightened 5-year-old tells when they are backed into a corner. Alina knew, with a chilling certainty, that everything she had been told about this boy was a fabrication. The confrontation happened during bath time that evening. It was their usual routine. The bathroom was steamy and warm, smelling of lavender. Alina had filled the tub and was turning to grab a towel while Thomas stood by the sink in his pajamas. "Alina," he said, his voice tight with anxiety, "don't use the blue bottle of bubble bath tonight. It makes my skin itchy. Use the white one." Alina froze, her back to him. She was standing in front of a shelf with 6 identical, unopened bottles of luxury bath products. They were all the same shape, the same size. The only difference was the color of the liquid inside. There was absolutely no way to distinguish them by touch or smell. Slowly, dread pooling in her stomach, she turned around. Thomas was staring at the floor, biting his lip, realizing his mistake too late. "Thomas," Alina said, her voice shaking not with anger, but with a profound, overwhelming sadness. "Look at me." He shook his head violently. "I can't, I'm blind." "You're not," she whispered, taking a step towards him. "You knew where the book fell before it hit the floor. You knew the dragon's hat was orange, and you know which bottle is blue." She knelt in front of him, gripping his small shoulders gently. "Sweetheart, you have to tell me the truth, can you see?" It was as if a dam had broken. Thomas let out a strangled sob that seemed to tear his throat, collapsing into her arms. He clung to her with a desperation that was terrifying, his small body racked with violent tremors. "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry," he choked out between gasps for air, burying his wet face in her neck. "I promised not to tell. I promised myself." Alina held him tighter, rocking him on the cold tile floor, utterly bewildered. "Who did you promise, baby?" "Why would you pretend?" "Because of Mummy," he sobbed, the words tumbling out in a chaotic rush of confession. "Daddy says she died to fix me." Alina felt sick as she pieced together the fragmented story through his tears. The trip to Europe when he was a toddler wasn't just a holiday. It was a last-ditch experimental treatment for his failing sight. And it had worked. He remembered waking up and seeing the light, seeing his mother's smiling face. But on the way to the airport to fly home, the accident happened. A drunk driver. His mother died instantly. Alexander, stuck at home with work, had been destroyed. "When we got back," Thomas whispered, pulling back slightly to look at Alina with eyes that were red-rimmed but perfectly clear, focusing sharply on her face. "Daddy was so broken. He kept saying it. He kept saying, she went there to save his eyes and she died for it." He looked at me like if I could see, then it meant her death was my fault. Like I traded her life for my eyes. Alina felt a murderous rage bubble up inside her towards Alexander Ashford, a man so consumed by his own grief narrative that he had psychologically paralyzed his own son. "And then the doctors here," Thomas continued, wiping his nose on his sleeve. "They didn't believe it worked. They tested me, but I was scared and I didn't answer right, so they told Daddy I was still blind. And Daddy," he looked relieved, he said, "at least she didn't die for nothing. At least she tried." The twisted logic made Alina want to scream. Alexander needed the tragedy to have meaning, even if it meant condemning his son to darkness. "So I pretended," Thomas said, his voice small and defeated. "I thought if I stayed blind, Daddy wouldn't be so angry at me for being alive when Mummy isn't. I've been pretending for 3 years, Alina. I'm so tired of bumping into things." Alina grabbed his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. "Listen to me, Thomas Ashford. Listen to me very closely. Your mother died in a car accident. It was a terrible, stupid, unfair tragedy. It had absolutely nothing to do with your eyes. It was not a trade. It was not your fault." She wiped his tears away fiercely. "Your father is wrong. He is grieving, and he is twisted up inside, and he has put a burden on you that no adult should ever carry, let alone a 5-year-old boy. You are not broken. You do not have to live in the dark to make him feel better." Thomas looked at her, hope and terror warring in his eyes. "But if he knows I can see, he'll hate me. He'll think I tricked him." "He won't hate you," Alina said with a conviction she didn't entirely feel but knew she had to project. "But we are going to stop this lie right now. You are going to be a child, Thomas, a seeing child who runs and plays and watches cartoons." She stood up, pulling him to his feet. She cleaned his face, dressed him in fresh pajamas, and took his hand. Her own fear was immense. She was about to confront one of the most powerful men in the state, but her protective instinct for this little boy was stronger. "Where are we going?" Thomas asked, his voice trembling. Alina led him out of the nursery and towards the stairs, towards the forbidden wing of the house. "We are going to see your father," she said grimly, "and we are going to turn on the lights." They marched down the silent hallway of the West Wing. The door to Alexander's study was slightly ajar, a sliver of yellow light cutting across the dark carpet. Alina could hear the low hum of his voice on a conference call. She didn't hesitate. She pushed the heavy mahogany door open. Alexander was behind his massive desk, 3 monitors illuminating his tired face. He looked up, sharply annoyed at the intrusion, his finger hovering over the mute button. "Miss Martinez." He snapped, his voice like cracking ice. "I made it explicitly clear that I am never to be disturbed in here, especially not with my son." Alina stepped fully into the room, pulling a terrified Thomas to her side. She didn't care about the job anymore. She didn't care about the money or the reference. She only cared about the boy gripping her hand. "Hang up the phone, Mr. Ashford," Alina commanded, her voice shaking with suppressed fury. Alexander stared at her, stunned by her insubordination. "Excuse me. Hang up the phone," she repeated louder. "We need to talk about your son. We need to talk about the lie this house is built on." Alexander looked from her to Thomas, his expression darkening. "Get out," he growled. "You're fired, both of you get out." Alina didn't move. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, brightly colored rubber ball she had taken from the nursery. She looked down at Thomas. "It's okay," she whispered to the boy. "Show him." Alexander Ashford stood up, his chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. His face was a mask of thunderous rage, the kind that usually sent boardrooms into silence. "I said get out," he roared, pointing a trembling finger at the door. "You are finished in this house, Miss Martinez, taking advantage of a disabled child to play games." "Catch!" Alina didn't wait. She didn't flinch. She simply tossed the bright yellow rubber ball through the air. It wasn't a gentle underarm toss. It was a direct throw, aiming straight for Thomas's chest. Time seemed to suspend in the room. Alexander's eyes went wide, his mouth opening to shout a warning to stop the ball from hitting his helpless, blind son. But before he could make a sound, Thomas's hand shot up. It was a reflex, swift and precise. His small fingers snatched the ball out of the air inches from his nose. He didn't fumble. He didn't search. He caught it, gripped it, and looked down at it. The silence that followed was heavier than the stone walls of the estate. It was a silence that shattered 3 years of reality. Alexander froze, his hand still outstretched in a command that no longer made sense. He looked at the ball in his son's hand, then up at Thomas's face. Thomas wasn't looking past him or through him. He was looking at him. "What?" Alexander's voice failed him. He slumped back against his desk as if his legs had been cut out from under him. "What did you just do?" "He caught the ball, Mr. Ashford," Alina said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper, stepping forward to stand protectively beside the boy. "Because he can see. He has been able to see since the day you brought him home from Europe." "That's impossible," Alexander whispered, shaking his head, his face draining of all color. "The doctors. They said the trauma, the optic nerve." "The doctors were wrong," Alina cut in. "And Thomas was scared. But he didn't keep pretending because he was confused, Alexander. He did it because he loves you." She knelt down, turning Thomas to face his father. "Tell him, Thomas. Tell him why you hid in the dark." Thomas took a step forward, clutching the yellow ball like a lifeline. He looked tiny against the backdrop of the massive office, but his gaze was steady. "I heard you," Thomas said, his voice trembling but clear. "That night, after the funeral, you were crying in here. You said Mummy died for nothing. You said she went to fix my eyes and she died and I was still broken." Tears began to spill down Thomas's cheeks again. "I didn't want her to die for nothing, Daddy. And I didn't want you to look at me and hate me because I was the reason she was gone. So I thought, if I stayed blind, then you wouldn't be so angry. You'd just be sad. And sad is better than angry." Alexander made a sound that was half sob, half gasp. The devastating logic of a grieving 5-year-old crashed into him. He realized, with a horror that surely eclipsed any pain he had ever felt, that his own grief, his own inability to process the tragedy, had forced his son into a self-imposed prison. He had been so consumed by the narrative of the tragic widower with the broken son that he hadn't truly looked at the boy in front of him. He had seen a symbol of his loss, not his child. "Oh my God," Alexander choked out. He rounded the desk, moving faster than Alina had ever seen him move, and fell to his knees on the carpet. He didn't care about the suit. He didn't care about the open conference line where his executives were undoubtedly listening in stunned silence. He reached out, his hands shaking violently, and cupped Thomas's face. "Thomas, can you see me?" Thomas nodded, a fresh tear tracking through the dust on his cheek. Yes, Daddy, you look tired. You have more gray hair than in the picture in the hallway. Alexander crumbled. The great titan of industry, the man of iron and ice, broke apart. He pulled Thomas into his chest, burying his face in the boy's small shoulder, and wept. It was a guttural, raw sound, the sound of 3 years of ice melting all at once. Thomas hesitated for a second, then wrapped his small arms around his father's neck, dropping the yellow ball. It rolled across the floor, coming to a stop against the leg of the desk, a bright spot of color in the monochromatic room. "It's okay, Daddy," Thomas whispered, stroking his father's hair, revering the rolls in a heartbreaking display of grace. "I'm not broken. We're not broken." Alina watched them, tears streaming down her own face, feeling like an intruder on a holy moment. She quietly backed away, reaching for the door handle. Her job was done. She had crossed a line that staff were never supposed to cross. She had humiliated him, exposed him, and broken every rule in her contract. She would pack her bags tonight. "Don't you dare leave." Alexander's voice stopped her. He didn't look up, still clutching Thomas as if he were the only solid thing in the universe, but the command was firm. He took a deep, shuddering breath and lifted his head, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. He looked at Alina. The arrogance was gone. The coldness was gone. In its place was a raw, terrified gratitude. "You saw him," Alexander said, his voice thick with emotion. "7 nannies, specialist doctors, me. We all looked at him, but you were the only one who actually saw him." "I just listened, sir," Alina said softly. Alexander stood up, lifting Thomas effortlessly into his arms, something Alina realized she had never seen him do. He looked at his son, really looked at him, tracing the line of his jaw, watching his eyes track the movement. "I have been a fool," Alexander admitted, the confession heavy in the air. "A blind fool. I let my grief build a wall around this house, and I trapped you inside it." He looked at Alina. "You are not fired, Miss Martinez. In fact, if you try to resign, I will double your salary again. I need you. He squeezed Thomas gently. We need you. We need to learn how to be a family again. And I suspect I need someone to remind me that I am a father first and a CEO second." "I'll stay," Alina smiled, wiping her eyes. "But there are going to be changes. No more dinners alone, no more forbidden rooms, and Thomas needs to go to a real school." "Agreed," Alexander said. He looked at the computer screens, still flickering with market data. He walked over and pressed the power button, plunging the room into darkness, illuminated only by the light from the hallway where Alina stood. "Starting tomorrow, tonight we are going to order pizza, and Thomas is going to tell me what color the box is." The transformation of the Ashford estate didn't happen overnight, but it started that moment. Over the next year, the mausoleum became a home. The heavy velvet curtains were tied back to let the sun in. The silence was replaced by the sound of running feet, Thomas making up for lost time, tearing through the corridors with a boundless energy that exhausted even Alina. Alexander changed too. He stopped working weekends. He was seen in the park, playing catch with a boy who never missed a ball. The society pages stopped writing about the tragic recluse and started writing about the philanthropist who launched a new pediatric vision wing at the city hospital. Alina stayed for 5 years. She stayed until Thomas was 10 and off to boarding school, not because he was sent away, but because he wanted to go, confident and whole. On her last day, Alexander called her into his office. It was no longer a war room. It was cluttered with Lego creations and framed photos of a smiling boy with bright blue eyes. "I can never repay you," Alexander said, handing her a check that would allow her to start her own school, a dream she had told him about years ago. "You gave me back my son. You gave me back my life." "You did the work, Alexander," Alina said, taking his hand. "I just turned on the light." She walked out of the estate that day, not as a servant, but as family. She looked back once at the great stone house. It didn't look like a fortress anymore. In the upstairs window, she saw Thomas waving furiously, and behind him, Alexander. She waved back, smiling. They weren't ghosts anymore. They were just a father and a son, seeing each other clearly for the first time. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel and hit the like button. Remember, sometimes the hardest things to see are the ones right in front of us. Share this video to spread the message that it's never too late to heal.